your screen. I will introduce you anyway. Well, now that Arnie is here, we can definitely um, get on the road. And I'm glad to see lots of people with their cameras on. I don't know Nick's preferences, but giving talks to a collection of black boxes is really a kind of a dismal business and should not be tolerated. All right, so welcome to everybody this morning. Great to see you all. Um, I'm happy to uh, introduce Nick Gaspelin from uh, now these days from Missouri. Um, Nick's got a good uh, trek through the psychological world. He was an undergrad at Iowa with Kathleen Moore and with Hollingworth there at that. No, it says
Sean
with
Becerra.
Sean Becerra also. Um, I went off to do his PhD at the University of New Mexico with Eric Ruthruff, one of my favorite names in experimental psychology because his last name sounds like something that a good dog might say. Um, and then he was a postdoc with Steve Luck in at Davis and UC Davis. And Nick reports this morning that Steve has already made his apologies for why he's not here at this talk, given that we insist on holding our meetings at 6 a.m. California time, uh, and that's too early in the day for most sensible people on the West Coast. Uh, so I think of Nick as one of the current leaders in what you might think of as the study of the real nuts and bolts of visual attention. Um, and I confess that I always feel a bit guilty about not having all the details of those nuts and bolts at my fingertips. I feel about that a little bit of the way I feel about philosophy as a topic. I admire it, but kind of don't do it, um, and it hurts when I try. Um, but um, Nick has been working on um, questions of when you can suppress things that you don't want to attend to. And last year, is it last year? Yeah, I guess it is last year. Last year, he published a paper called Signal Suppression 2.0, a revised account of attentional capture and suppression. And I was immediately drawn to this because I'm drawn to anybody who puts version numbers on their models. It'll take him a few years to get up to 6.0, like guided search, but it's a good start. And so Nick promised he would come and tell us all about it. And so I will turn the Zoom over to Nick. If people have questions, if there's a urgent question, we can interrupt things. Otherwise, what we'll do is have questions at the end, and feel free to pop questions into the chat if something looks suitably like nobody will understand the rest of this talk if we don't answer this right now. I'll bust in, but otherwise, we'll leave some time at the end for questions. Take it away, Nick.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me here. Um, yeah, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Signal Suppression 2.0 account. When I was preparing this talk, I was talking with some of my students in the lab, and they said, you can't just do all the old stuff. You've got to show some of the new stuff as well. So I wanted to make sure to make time for that. So this talk will be a kind of a little bit different than the typical talk that I give, and then I'm going to try to get through some of the early stuff a little bit faster and move towards some of the newer stuff related to signal suppression at the end. Before I start, I just wanted to say it's really an honor to give a talk in Jeremy Wolfe's lab because Jeremy had a huge impact on my career, and I consider him to be one of my heroes. When I was an undergrad at University of Iowa from 2004 to 2008, I was working in Sean Becerra's lab, and there was this new professor who was starting at the time, Kathleen Moore, and Sean said, she's teaching a perception class next semester. It'll be really good. You'll love it. You should take her class. And she taught her class using the first edition of this book at the time, which was Jeremy Wolfe's Sensation and Perception book. And I loved the textbook and the class so much that I would bother Kathleen after class during her office hours. And eventually, I don't know if she was just trying to get rid of me from office hours, but she said, you should go to graduate school. I think you're ready for it. And now I teach perception and I use Jeremy's textbook in my classes. So Jeremy has had a really strong impact on the way that I think about attention and perception, and is probably one of the big reasons that I'm actually here doing it to this day. Um, okay, so today's talk is about attention capture. And I think it's good to kind of step back at first and think about the kind of big picture of the attentional capture debate and what the question is. And when you look at a picture like this, the first thing that you seem to notice are the salient objects that are in this display. So this bright red flowers immediately stick out to us, and that gives us the impression that salient stimuli automatically have this power to attract our attention. But there's a little bit of a conundrum there and a mystery to this observation. If salient objects just automatically capture attention and we have no power to avoid attentional capture by salient objects, then our attention would be constantly captured by irrelevant information, and it'd be really difficult for us to accomplish goal-directed visual behaviors like driving your car or searching a grocery store aisle for a can of soup, if you were simply at the whim of the most salient stimulus in your environment. But if salient stimuli don't have any power to attract attention, then why does it feel like salient stimuli are often the first thing that we notice in visual scenes? And this is relevant to any kind of real world scenario where you're trying to use some kind of visual warning signal to warn users who are busy doing something about some kind of danger. You're trying to use salience. We often use things like brightly colored objects or flashing lights to try to attract operators' attentions when we assume that they'll be busy doing something else. It's also relevant to any kind of model of visual search. I still have my notes from Kathleen Moore's class, and I found this slide from her lectures, which I had starred apparently, meaning that I thought it was going to be important at some point. I guess I probably didn't understand how important it would be to my career, but you can see here, this is maybe guided search 2.0. I'm not sure exactly where the figure is from, but the idea is a lot of models of visual search, including guided search, talk about how bottom-up and top-down goals can be combined. And here, bottom-up would mean salience. And there's a little bit of a mystery as to actually how that would occur. And just to prove that I'm not being unfair to Jeremy, this is still something that's occurring even in current versions of guided search. And so it's really important for us to try to answer the question of how bottom-up salience influences attention, because it's going to be really important for people who are trying to build models of visual search. If we can't clearly say whether or not a salient signal automatically attracts attention, it's going to be difficult to build a model of the order of objects that get searched or how people search visual scenes. So a question that's dominated research on attention capture for the past 30 or 40 years has been, can salient stimuli attract visual attention regardless of our goals? So if you're someone who does attention capture research, I'm going to just spend a little bit of time for the sort of folks who are less familiar with this topic, just explaining some of the background. So if you're someone who's done a lot of stuff related to this topic, you might kind of put your brain on pause for the next few minutes while I kind of catch everyone up to speed. So stimulus, the attentional capture debate was originally divided into two competing accounts that were really, really directly opposed to one another. Stimulus-driven accounts propose that salient stimuli automatically capture attention regardless of what your goals are. So one really well-studied type of salient stimulus would be a color singleton. A salient stimulus here in this debate refers to any kind of object that is different from its neighbors and low-level features. So like a uniquely colored object, like a lone red object in a green field would be a color singleton because it's uniquely colored. Another type of well-studied stimulus in this debate are abrupt onsets. These are objects that suddenly appear in an environment. I don't know if I'll have a lot of time to talk about abrupt onsets today, but know that there's also a rich history of people studying these types of stimuli as well. So stimulus-driven accounts propose that these types of salient stimuli have this automatic power to attract our attention. You know, one of the most famous studies supporting stimulus-driven accounts has come from Jan Tevis, and he had a paradigm where participants would look for a target, and that target would be a shape singleton of some point, of some kind. So here you might be looking for a diamond amongst circles, and you would report the tilt of a line inside of the target object when you find it as which way tilting left or right. And on half of trials, a color singleton would be present, and this color singleton would never appear at the target location, meaning that you should try to avoid the color singleton if you're someone performing this search task. In other words, it's anti-predictive of where the target is. But the canonical finding in this area is that if you look at response times in a task like this, participants are slower when the singleton is present than when it's absent. And sometimes this is called a singleton presence cost. And this singleton presence cost is taken as evidence that the salient distractor automatically interfered with visual search for a target. Goal-driven accounts, on the other hand, argue that only stimuli that match what a viewer is looking for or your attentional set will capture attention. So if you're looking through a grocery store aisle and you've decided that you're going to look for a red pepper, maybe you can constrain your search to only red objects, and that'll prevent other salient objects like advertisement signs, other salient visual features, maybe these yellow peppers kind of stick out of this display. They won't automatically capture attention because they fall outside of your immediate goals. So goal-driven counts propose that you can actually block capture by salient stimuli by whatever your intentions are of your search target. And a really sort of classic study supporting this came from Howard Eguth and colleagues. And they just noted that in the typical paradigm supporting stimulus-driven accounts, the target itself is a singleton. And perhaps this enables capture by the salient distractor. In other words, in the previous task that I showed you, participants were asked to search for an object that was salient. And maybe when you're asked to search for one thing that's salient and try to ignore another thing that's salient, that's hard to do. You have a kind of goal contamination problem where you're looking for something salient and trying to ignore something else that's also salient. And when this task was adapted to prevent that type of search strategy from happening by using these heterogeneous distractors in this display. So you're still looking for a diamond, reporting the tilt of a line inside, but the target is made non-salient to make the salient distractor fully task irrelevant in this task. You can eliminate the singleton presence cost. And this was assumed to be evidence for goal-driven accounts of attentional capture, suggesting that salient things do not automatically attract our attention. And this debate has gone on for a long, long time. This is I don't have time to go through the entire attentional capture debate, but there's been a lot of back and forth between these two competing camps of attentional capture. So a lot of my career has really focused on trying to reconcile these opposing theories into one coherent hybrid model of attentional capture. So I think one thing that we should be trying to figure out as a field is how can we sort of merge these two theories into a coherent sort of resolution. The signal suppression 1.0 account tried to do this. It was a hybrid model of attentional capture, and it was hybrid, and then it suggested that salient stimuli will automatically attempt to guide attention, that they generate this salient signal that sometimes was called an attend to me signal. So consistent with stimulus-driven models, salient stimuli really do compete for attention and may, under certain conditions, actually have the power to capture attention, but that the salient signal can be suppressed to prevent attentional capture from occurring, which would be consistent with goal-driven models. So it has a little bit of a stimulus-driven point to it and a little bit of a goal-driven point to it. And the basic prediction of the signal suppression 1.0 account was that if you're imagining some type of search task where a color singleton can be successfully ignored, and we're imagining some kind of attentional priority map where objects in the visual field are assigned some kind of weight denoting their likelihood of being attended, that you should see some evidence that the salience of the salient object is being pushed down below the level of other objects in the visual field, suggesting that it's being suppressed compared to other objects. A lot of the initial support for signal suppression 1.0 came from some early ERP studies where they noticed that singletons produce something that looks like the opposite of an N2PC component, which the N2PC is typically thought to reflect attentional allocation towards an object, and they notice that there's a kind of positive going component that's elicited by color singletons. And so the idea was maybe because it's the opposite of an N2PC, which means attention, that color singletons elicit the opposite of attention, which is being suppressed in this case. But I'll show you some evidence for this. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this part because I want to get to some of the new stuff to signal suppression 2.0. One way that we showed some evidence for signal suppression 1.0 is we developed a capture probe task. And the capture probe task was inspired by some studies that were done by Kyle Cave and colleagues, and they were meant to measure covert attention. And so what we did is we had participants perform a task that was a search task. And in the search task, they would look for a target. Here, they're looking for a target that is a diamond, and they're reporting whether or not the dot inside is on the left or right-hand side. And the diamond here appears amongst a bunch of homogeneous distractors, meaning that the target is salient. And they're trying to ignore a salient distractor. So this would typically be the conditions at which you would find some evidence of an RT-based capture effect from the color singleton. The trick is the new part of our studies that we added in this probe task. And in the probe task, the search array appeared for 200 milliseconds, and then letters were superimposed over every object in the search array, and participants' task was simply to report whichever letters that they could remember in the probe array. Typically, participants would only report, one or two letters in this task. The letters flash really, really quickly, making them all hard to see, and the response array acts kind of like a post mask in this design. And the idea is that if someone was attending a given location, they should be more likely to report the letter at that location. And if they're ignoring a given location, they should be less likely to report the letter at a given location. And so we were going to try to use this probe task to try to ascertain where people were covertly attending, where they were doing this task. Okay, so if we look at the results, the first thing is if we look at the RT results, you see that we're getting the canonical capture effect that you would expect in this version of the task, which kind of encourages the salient distractor to capture attention by its task relevance. We get a 65 millisecond singleton presence cost, suggesting that it's slowing them down. The key is what happens on the probe trials. Well, here I'm going to refer to the object that you're looking for as the target. the salient object that you're trying to ignore as the singleton distractor, and I'm going to refer to all of the other objects in the display as a non-singleton distractors. I'm going to take the average across the four of those locations in this plot. What you can see is participants were more likely to report probe letters at the singleton distractor location than the non-singleton distractor location, which is a kind of capture effect. And in addition, when the singleton is present, they're less likely to report the probes at the target location than they are when the singleton is absent, suggesting that the presence of the singleton is also impairing target detection. So all of this looks like capture, showing that our paradigm is sensitive to detect capture when the singleton is task relevant. We ran a second experiment where we adapted the singleton to be task irrelevant by making the target no longer salient itself. And when we do that, we find that we can eliminate the singleton presence cost on response time. And more importantly, if we look at probe report, what happens is instead of the singleton being boosted relative to the average non-singleton distractor, it's actually suppressed below the level of the other non-salient distractors in the display, suggesting that it's looking like it's actively suppressed. And we saw this basic pattern of results. We could replicate it across multiple experiments. We also showed some evidence that the same type of suppressive effect occurred when we looked at eye movements here. So for example, when we looked at if we had participants do a task where they were looking for a target, we got rid of the probe task and we just instead measured the destination of the first saccade in a task, we found that if we generated heat maps of eye movements, a lot of eye movements would go to the target, but there were these holes in the display wherever the singleton was when we encouraged conditions that were optimal for top-down control, suggesting that it was being suppressed compared to other objects in the display. And this occurred even for the fastest eye movements in this study. So we've got all this evidence. There's been a lot of evidence over the past 10 or so years that supported signal suppression 1.0. There were a lot of psychophysical studies that showed converging evidence, things like the probe task that I showed you just here. There have been many other studies showing similar types of probe suppression effects. There's also been a lot of stuff from eye movements, similar to some of the data that I was showing you here, where I'm showing that salient objects could be actively suppressed. There's a lot of ERP work showing that salient objects elicited a distractor positivity consistent with suppression. Computational models were developed showing that if you just include an inhibitory component and models of visual attention, you can generate a lot of results that look similar to like these probe tasks. You can generate ERP components that look a lot like a distractor positivity if you just include a suppressive component in your model of visual attention. And there's even some monkey neurophysiology studies showing that in early visual cortex, if you have a salient distractor present, the processing of that distractor is suppressed below the baseline level of other objects in the display. So there's been a lot of support for signal suppression 1.0, and that's ended up making it one of the leading models of attention capture. And a lot of the supporting evidence was just focused on showing that salient distractors can be suppressed below baseline levels in some way. And it's important to highlight that signal suppression is a hybrid theory that includes elements of both stimulus-driven and goal-driven accounts. And ultimately, it really helped move the attentional capture debate forward. And we ended up writing a paper, Steve Luck and I did, with Chip Folk and Roger Remington, who are, of course, leaders of and founders of the goal-driven perspective of attentional capture, and Jan Tevis, who's one of the leading perspectives on the bottom-up account, where we actually got both opposing accounts to agree upon some basic tenets that led towards a more coherent resolution. Namely, bottom-up theories agreed that top-down control could be implemented to prevent capture under certain situations, and goal-driven theorists agreed that stimuli could sometimes capture attention due to their bottom-up salience. we had some fun meetings at VSS coming up with these terms of a treaty in the attentional capture debate, and it was fun to sit at a table with all of these guys wearing sunglasses. It looked like something from a spy movie where we were all like passing around documents and this it was very fun. Okay, but a lot's happened since 2010. The iPad came out in 2010. Taylor Swift was getting her start to her career in 2010, and that's when the original signal suppression came out. I looked like this when the early signal suppression stuff was happening. So we thought it's probably time to update our model to account for more recent findings. And so recently we've updated our account to a signal suppression 2.0 model. And we'd actually tried to update the account before without including model numbers, but the problem is it was really confusing. So I think maybe Jeremy can attest to this, but a great reason to number your models is because now you can actually say to people, that's 1.0 version of the model. We're now on 2.0. We've actually addressed this. It helps people keep track of the changes that you're making. Okay, so here's some changes that we've made. This first change really relates to learning, which are some things that I'm going to show you next. Signal suppression 1.0 proposed that distractor suppression occurred due to explicit goals, meaning that it was really due to active top-down control engaged by observers. Then it proposed also that suppression was applied to a generalized salient signal that was not attached to specific features or locations. So the idea is that you would just kind of directly squash some kind of salient signal, and that you could do that based upon your explicit goals. And it didn't include any kind of mechanisms to explain learned biases of attention. So signal suppression 2.0, one of the main updates to it have mostly focused on trying to add mechanisms that can explain how learned biases occur that allow people to ignore salient distractors. And I'll show some data here in a minute that kind of highlights why learning is probably an important component to include in a model of how people learn to ignore salient distractors. And the basic premise of signal suppression 2.0 is that learning occurs due to a comparison process that occurs between the attended object and the target representation that you have. And the idea is that if the object that you're attending matches the target representation, so like if you make a shift of focused attention to a stimulus with target properties to the target, you'll end up boosting those properties in attentional control settings for future shifts of attention. But if you attend something that mismatches your attentional set, like if a capture would occur and you accidentally attend a salient distractor, a suppressive signal is sent to the attentional control settings to downweight the features and locations associated with the object that captured attention. And so we kind of talked about it in the paper as you can kind of imagine this as an attentional scorecard, where you can imagine that what will happen is as someone gains experience and mistakenly shifts attention towards a salient distractor, they might learn from those experiences and start to downweight anything that's associated with the distractor. And so here we're showing, different properties of objects in the visual field, their shape, their location, their color. And the idea is maybe early on in an experiment, when someone's getting experience with a salient distractor, they may actually get genuinely captured by the salient distractor. But when they get captured, that comparison process causes them to turn down the features and attentional control settings here that are related to that distractor moving forward. And when they eventually get to the target, they'll start to boost features that are relevant to the target. And this will occur throughout someone's experience with a sort of given task where they may get captured initially but gradually they can learn to suppress the salient object and learn to adjust their attentional control settings that way. So the key prediction here is that capture will actually be a kind of beneficial thing to suppression because it'll actually serve as a kind of learning signal to learn some of the properties that are associated with the salient distractor to help you ignore it in future attentional shifts. So one of the new predictions is that capture, at least initially, may actually be beneficial. Okay, so I'm going to show some new stuff along these lines from my graduate student, Yue Zhang, that suppression can be rapidly learned. And she's been having participants do these tasks where she had participants perform a task, and it looks like a lot of our typical tasks that are meant to show suppression via eye tracking. And what they do is they do 5 trial runs where the color of the salient distractor and target is constant. So here you're looking for a diamond and you're trying to ignore a color singleton. And every 5 trials, the display colors change, forcing you to learn a new regularity about the salient distractor to suppress. You'll have to learn a new color to suppress in this task. And the key prediction of signal suppression 2.0 would be that when you initially change the color, you should get a big capture effect. And then after capture occurs, participants should learn to suppress the salient distractor in these displays. And this was very much inspired by some work by Isaac Savelson and Sean Becerra as well, showing that participants can really, really quickly learn to suppress things. Okay, so if you look at heat maps of eye movements and a task like this, what you'll see is that on the first trial, here I've rotated all the heat maps so the target is at the top position, and the white arrow points to where the singleton was. The singleton could appear at any location in this task, but I'm just showing the trials where it appeared 60 degrees away. All of the heat maps look the same regardless of target singleton angular distance. So I don't want you to be worried about that. But what you can see is that on the first trial where the regularity changes, we get this big capture effect by the salient distractor, but pretty rapidly after only a single trial, participants start to turn down the salient distractor's colors and learn to suppress it. So really showing this rapid learning that's occurring really with only a few trials of exposure to the salient distractor. You can see this more clearly if we make a difference function between the amount of saccades that are directed to the salient distractor versus those that are directed to the non-singleton distractor. So here, a positive value means that first eye movements are more likely to be directed to the salient distractor than the baseline level of non-salient distractors. And a negative value means that they're less likely to be directed. And you can see that we get this capture effect on trial 1, followed by suppression on subsequent trials. Our later experiments tried to play around with manipulating whether capture occurred on the first trial or not in these runs, and to see how that would influence subsequent suppression. So we had, in the second experiment, we intermixed displays where there could either be a low salience singleton that was a low contrast singleton, meaning that it was close to the target color. And the idea is that this should not strongly capture attention on the first sort of switch trial because it's only weakly salient, whereas our high salience singletons that we were using in the previous experiment should capture attention on the first trial because they're highly salient. So the question is, will the magnitude of capture on trial 1 influence subsequent suppression on following trials in the run sequence? So if we do this kind of 5 trial run approach, and the answer is if we look at capture effects on trial 1 for the high salience group, you'll see that we get this large capture effect followed by suppression, replicating the same result from our initial experiment. But if we look at the low salience group, you can see that we don't get capture by the salient distractor, but that we also don't get suppression on subsequent trials of this salient distractor below baseline levels, suggesting that it's not capturing attention, which isn't leading to the type of suppression that you would typically see. In a final experiment, we tried to more directly test this in another way, which is we um, we tried to prevent capture from occurring in initial exposures to a highly salient distractor. And we shortened our runs because it was really hard to give participants instructions about when to move their eyes or not. And you'll see that's a pretty important part of this experiment. So we're using 3 trial runs here. And what we have is in our search, some of our runs, it's just for 3 trials in a row, you're just searching the search display and you're trying to prevent an eye movement to the salient distractor. So this is pretty typical to what I've shown in previous experiments here, except it's a 3 trial run and then a 4 trial run. The key is that in some of our experiments on the first 2 trials of the task, you're not allowed to make any eye movements away from central fixation. We give you a central task to do where you're trying to say whether a letter at fixation is an L or an R, and pressing a button correspondingly. And anytime you make an eye movement, we beep at you in this task, meaning you're not allowed to direct your eyes to the singleton. So we're trying to occupy at least overt attention and as much of covert attention as we can at the center of the display to prevent people from getting captured by the salient distractor. And the question is, will preventing initial capture from occurring, will that disrupt learned suppression in this task? And the answer is, if we look at the critical trial, this trial 3 in the task that's always a search task where participants we see our sort of typical suppression effect that's developed when they've been previously doing search, but when they've done the central task that prevents attentional capture from occurring, or at least overt attentional capture from occurring, we don't get the same type of learned suppression by trial 3. So it really is suggesting that disrupting the initial capture event from occurring, that kind of sends this error signal to attentional control settings to say, hey, turn this down. This is capturing attention. If you disrupt that capture from occurring, you'll also disrupt learned suppression. An important thing is that the same pattern occurs for spatial suppression as well. So this idea of capture and then suppression occurs there as well. So in another paper that followed up on our psych science paper, we first kind of replicated the basic result showing that people could learn these feature-based contingencies really rapidly within 5 trials. So we would do the trick that I showed you before, where every 5 trials, we would change the display colors. And we showed that we could get the same kind of ocular motor learning effects. In a second experiment of this new project, we tried to see if we could get the same thing to apply to spatial regularities. There's been a lot of stuff from Jan Tevis's lab showing that participants can learn to suppress objects based upon their location. We were curious whether the same kind of rapid suppression applies to their results as well. And so what we did in our task is we made it impossible to engage in any kind of feature-based suppression. So you're looking for like a diamond or a circle in this task. And every trial, the displays change color. So you can't learn anything about color to instantiate any kind of feature-based suppression of the singleton. And instead, the singleton stays in a consistent location for 5 trials in a row. So you can see here, I've circled them here. It's appearing in the same position before it changes to a new location for the next 5 trials. And this is occurring throughout the experiment. And the answer is, if we look at heat maps of first saccades in this task, again, white arrows pointing to where the singleton is, we get the same type of rapid learning effect where we get capture on the first trial with the switch. And then afterwards, we get suppression of the salient distractor, below baseline levels of other objects in the display. We also ran an experiment with a combined regularity, and this is a great example of why you don't always listen to your mentor. Yue came to me, Yue Zhang, and proposed that running this experiment. And I said, oh, we don't need to run this experiment. It's and she went and she did the best thing a graduate student can do, which is she ran a secret experiment to prove me wrong that it looks really cool and that we should do it. And this experiment, the singleton color changes in color and location every 5 trials. So you have both regularities are changing at once every 5 trials. And what we see in this task is you get really, really big capture. So you get mega capture by the salient distractor on the first trial with the switch, followed by mega suppression of the salient distractor subsequently. So if you overlay the 3 experiments of either color-based suppression, so featural regularity, spatial suppression, so the location-based regularity, or the combined color and location regularity together, you'll see that when we use the combined regularity, we get this larger initial capture effect by the combined distractor than either single regularity alone. And then we get an increased suppression of the combined distractor later on, which is fitting this story that an initial event of capture can lead to this type of suppression to occur. So if you're interested in learning more about some of this newer stuff about how we learn to suppress salient distractors, stay tuned to work by Yue Zhang in the lab. Jeremy, how long do the talks usually go for in this lab? Because I can pivot. Is this a good time to kind of wrap up and move towards questions?
I would say that, yes. And if it turned out that you had one more cool thing, that would be okay too. What will happen is that at the top of the hour, a whole bunch of people will need to go off and do whatever the next thing is.
Yeah, why don't I wrap up? I had some
Okay,
stuff
good.
about suppression of highly salient things and how we can do that, and suppression of other types of objects than color singletons. So maybe that'll inspire some of you to ask about those types of things during the question period if you would like. I have a lot of things prepared in that way. Okay. So overall summary, salient distractors can be inhibited to reduce visual distraction. And we developed a set of converging methods, things like probe task, eye movements, and ERPs to measure and study this suppressive process of attentional capture. And signal suppression 2.0 has been revised to explain how we learn to inhibit distracting stimuli as a function of experience. So the big update to signal suppression 2.0 is to explain how we learn to suppress stuff. The signal suppression 2.0 model contains a complete model of visual attention, and it's very much inspired by other theories of visual search, like guided search models of visual attention. We're very clear about that in the paper. And I want to kind of really quickly take you through the model to show you, to identify some of the updates that we made to our model and kind of explain how it worked. The basic part that's common to any theory of visual search is that we first propose that the visual image is parsed into feature maps, and that these feature maps, the next stage is that they then feed into some type of attentional gain controls that modulate either first order features, things like color or shape could be used to modulate to either upweight or downweight given features. Spatial locations could also be modulated in these maps. There's also a second order sort of modulation that can occur as well, meaning that things could be modulated based upon their contrast with other objects, a kind of generalized salient suppression. So one thing to kind of notice that's the first update to our model is that we're now allowing suppression to occur via multiple gain controls, spatial, featural, general salience. There's multiple paths to suppression. It's not only second order suppression, it's not only first order features, and it's not limited to objects. It's not limited by how salient an object is. And then next, a priority map is generated, and focused visual search occurs in the priority map. And the key is that during visual search, when an object is attended, there's a comparison process that occurs with the target representation that leads to feedback signals that modulate attentional control settings. And those attentional control settings can then be used to modulate the attentional gain controls. So What we find in our updated model is that suppression is, so the basic idea is suppression is learned by incrementing the attentional control settings based upon this feedback signal of this comparison process with the target representation of whatever is being currently attended. And so our models are really no different than a lot of classic models of visual search, just with the added assumption that attention is guided away from specific features and locations. There have been some recent critiques of signal suppression, um, likening it to feature integration theory or other models, and as if it's a bad thing. But I have to say, I actually those models like guided search and feature integration directly inspired a lot of the work that we've done on signal suppression and have inspired these types of models that we're showing here. So we very much embrace that our model is related to basic models of visual attention and visual search. So um, thanks and happy to take questions.
Okay, well, we can indulge in whatever zoomy variety of violent agreement and appreciation that you might have, and people can use the little hand raising thing, which will cue them up. And I'll get started by asking one question about the Zhang experiment that you were talking about. You did the version where you changed color and location after 5 trials and saw the sort of rapid, very vigorous adaptation of suppression of those singletons. What happens if you change both color and location on every trial? It would be in your interest to learn that whatever the singleton is, I want to kill it. But do you do that as effectively as what you were showing when you've got a string of the same kind of singleton?
That's a really good suggestion, and we should run something like that. I think the sort of
Oh, I've been
general.
running it in secret while I. No, I haven't.
Uh-oh, you should have told me that before my talk then.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that it's harder to get these below baseline suppression effects. So for example, actually, I think I've already run this experiment as what I remember. It's just part of a different paper. Steve Luck and I had a paper from 2018 in JPHPP where we were interested in seeing if people could just suppress things when they don't know their features or locations. We found that we couldn't get the same below baseline suppression effects in those types of task. So the answer is we typically don't see suppression there, even when we're alternating across the entire experiment, but I could see how that's useful. One interesting experiment that we ran that was a suggestion of a reviewer, and thanks if you're the reviewer that's somewhere out there on the Zoom call, because it was a great suggestion that we added to the paper is that's kind of related to your comment is someone said, what happens if you interrupt the sequence? Is this just priming or is this a more long-term learning that could survive an interruption by some sort of stimulus that doesn't match the full run? And so we ran an experiment where in the middle of the run, we just introduced irregularity sometimes on some of the runs that was a completely different location and color. So we just like threw in a trial that like imagine it's like green singleton bottom right corner, green singleton bottom right corner, green singleton bottom right color, and then corner, and then all of a sudden we introduce a trial where it's like yellow singleton top right corner or something like that. We change the location and color, and then we go back to their original sequence again. And the answer is that participants can basically resume suppression as usual, even when the interrupting stimulus intervenes, suggesting that they're learning something that's not just simple, like short-term learning from the previous trial, that they're actually accumulating their learning across multiple trials of experience. In other words, it can survive an interrupting trial, at least to an extent. Yes, Simon?
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was super, super interesting. Could you go back to the picture of your model really quickly?
Yeah, let me
So I'm,
get all the stuff
yeah,
off
yeah.
of it.
I'm curious, and it's possible you answered this in your experiments and I just missed it. Um, do you know if when you suppress, say, like a first order feature, does it like drag the other features along in any capacity, or are they completely separate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like if you suppress like a color per se, does it also lead to suppression of of the shape per se? I think the probe
Hmm.
task data that I've showed before suggests that the suppression is applied to the entire object based upon a first order regularity. In other words, if it's suppressing the letter that's inside of this object, you might see that. So there is, so in other words, the model proposes that suppression results in a change to the attentional priority map, so to speak, that affects the entirety of the object, or at least its priority during visual search. Um, Another thing is that if there was some kind of, because of the way that things would increment, if you think kind of back to this slide on the attentional scorecard and how that might develop over time, it we're assuming in the example that I'm showing here, which you can kind of see in the paper, maybe work through more slowly, that if if some kind of feature, like if the singleton was always a circle, in this case it's not, it just happens to be a circle in a couple of the examples, that the attentional system would pick up on that and start to suppress the shape as well. So any kind of regularity associated with the distracting stimulus will be suppressed as a prediction of signal suppression 2.0. So maybe someone should go out there and test some of these predictions, because it's, I think exactly what we're trying to do with signal suppression 2.0 is generate things that maybe mean that we have to do a signal suppression 3.0 at some point.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, you keep yourself in business for years that way, I happen to know. Nabu, checking in from Brazil.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for the great talk. Um, while you were presenting, I was wondering, does this signal suppression explain performance in the anti-saccade tax? And also, does the model factor in phasic alertness?
Yeah. Yeah, those are two really good questions. Let me break them down and answer each separate question. So, the first is, does it describe performance in the anti-saccade task? I think the main difference between anti-saccade task and the type of suppression that I'm showing here, and there were big debates about this in a group that wrote a recent paper on terminology. Jeremy was part of this, and a lot of the people on the Zoom call were part of this and can attest that I'm not hallucinating. This is about this idea of reactive versus suppressive, and Nancy Carlisle ended up making a figure to help us all agree with one another about what it could mean, or at least what our disagreements were. It's important to at least agree about your disagreements. um, and uh, and I would think what happens in an anti-saccade task is you shift covert attention to something and then you suppress it before you move your eyes away. In our task, we propose that actually the attentional priority is directly affected before the first shift of attention. And part of the reason that we propose that is if we look at, um, like some of our measures of covert attention, like the probe task or our ERPs, don't show any evidence that attention shifts to the singleton before it's suppressed. And even in our eye movement studies, the saccades, if you look at saccade latency over time, we find that even the fastest saccades are suppressed. So I had a student that did this meta-analysis across 12 studies, and she showed that even if you break the 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 data down into like 20 quantiles of saccade latency, that even the fastest quantile, which is like 91 milliseconds, doesn't show any evidence of capture in this task of the eyes, suggesting that there's not some sort of rapid shift of covert attention before the eyes take off. But so that's what I would see as the primary difference, but that doesn't mean that some kind of reactive suppression couldn't be applied to the anti-saccade task. Does that help as a kind of answer to the difference there? And then your second question was, sorry, can you remind me of what the second question was?
If it factors in phasic alertness.
We don't include anything like that, although I'm aware of some of the sort of like phasic shifts of attention stuff, and that work is really, really cool. I haven't, maybe there's something that I don't know about related to attention capture and phasic alignments that I need to be aware of. That would be something that we could include. Is there a paper that you're thinking of specifically that I should know about?
I was just thinking about it because there was this paper that I came across. It's basically centered on anti-saccade tax,
Yeah.
like that window where the participant is like preparing to actually respond.
Well, maybe
Just for the relative novices on this call, an anti-saccade task is one where a spot appears, let's say on the left, and your instruction is to make a saccade in the other direction to the right, and that's um, not as easy as it might sound.
yeah.
I also have a third question.
Let's let Roger in
Oh,
here. Roger
So-
Ratcliffe, who should add his last name one of these days to his Zoom.
Yeah, I'm lazy. So sort of following up on that, is this sort of like an all or none or continuous response? So if you think about the Simon task where a stimulus is on the right or left, the best models that handle that are ones that say initially you get evidence for the direction, and then this is suppressed and evidence comes for the target decision. So imagine if you have a stimulus and the correct response is to the left, but it's presented on the right. What you get is a slowdown in the reaction time distribution. I think you talked about this with the quantiles of the distribution. So what that would suggest is that initially it captures attention, then gets suppressed. Or is it a single evidence that's accumulated and the suppression and target information are available at the same time? Now, this would be modeled. I have a model for 2D representation. It's a 2018 Psych Review paper where you have an array of pixels and there are 2 or 3 bright patches and you get evidence rising in these. And what you could do with that kind of model, I think it's sort of like the model you have, except you could put a threshold on and you could look at the time course and estimate parameters for what's going on. Because I don't believe these models actually implemented models with evidence accumulation. These salience maps, they're like
No.
okay. Yeah,
It's funny because I was actually reading some of your papers yesterday, so it's nice to meet you. And it's funny how it feels like a coincidence. I wanted to kind of show some of this evidence here just so you can kind of see the eye movement evidence, although there's ERP evidence and probe evidence too. So here's an example where this paper was, we gave a cute title that was also inspired by Jeremy's work. It was called "What Can You Learn from a 500,000 saccades about what do 500,000 saccades tell us about distractor suppression?" But I promise I won't steal any more paper titles from Jeremy in the near future. So it's in, but this was pulled across 750,000 eye movements. So it's a lot of saccades. So it enabled us to really break down the quantiles quite a bit for each subject. And you can see that if you're looking at the percentage of eye movements to each object in the display over time, that you get this kind of this sort of function whereby the singleton distractor is not suppressed in the fastest eye movements, but it's also not, there's no bump up, suggesting that the singleton distractor is being attended above the baseline level of anything else. So it really just looks like the fastest eye movements in a task like this are just being randomly allocated to objects. So if a saccade takes off at 91 milliseconds, it's just a completely unguided eye movement in these tasks. We see similar things if we look at more continuous measures, like if we look at continuous gaze position over time and we break down the visual field into quadrants and we try to look at like do they get closer to the singleton, or do the eye movements kind of steer towards the singleton and then move back towards the target? If that was going to happen, we should see some of the gaze samples show this early kind of bump before they move away, and we don't see anything like that in our eye movement data. So it's not for lack of trying that we haven't seen it. We just don't see evidence of that. But I think you're proposing something a little bit different than that. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Am I?
Yeah, I think that sort of means that the suppression and signal are happening at the same time.
Yeah,
It's not like you're initially getting captured by that and then reversing.
yeah. Now, interesting, when we set up conditions that lead to capture,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like these conditions where you have like a pop out target and you're trying to ignore a pop out distractor. I wouldn't consider that a good pure test of attentional capture, because now you've confounded goals with salience. But in that condition, you do see an early bump, which is where a lot of that work comes from, or that the claims about that come from. So it's really about whether or not you can get really different results in these tasks depending on whether or not the singleton is task relevant. So if you see stuff like that, that's one thing that I always kind of keep in mind when I see that kind of early bias or early bottom-up bias sometimes.
So
Caitlin,
the conclusion is it depends.
depends on the task. Yeah, it's one of those really
Those
satisfying
are
explanations that begins with
the two conclusions that that almost always works are it depends and both sides are correct. That both of those usually work in these modeling situations. Bear, you got a question there?
Yeah, I was wondering if you have ever tested how long does it last? So like doing the suppression, seeing in the next 5 trials, and then stop showing the singleton, and then again showing the singleton, something like that to see how long it would last. And also another question that is all the time in my mind, if you have ever tested how if the subjects are conscious about this happening somehow, because there is a suppression in when you measure the eye movements, but you don't know if they are still aware that the singleton is still there.
Yeah. Let me answer the first question, then I have some slides that can actually answer the second question. So I'll spend more time. The first question is, like if you go back to an old color combination, do they suppress it just like before? And well, I actually have some slides to show. Well, the main thing is that that our results are pretty persistent across an experiment. So like we look at first half versus second half, we see that the same basic learning curves. So it's not like they're able, like all of the capture is occurring in the first part of the experiment and all the suppression is occurring in the second part of experiment. We're mixing up these different learning curves. That's not what's happening here. But it is an interesting idea if you revisit an old color. It's been a little bit complicated, and maybe UA and I should try to look at it. Because we use so many different color combinations in our paper. There were like 180 color combinations, and we made sure the new color was a certain distance and color space away from the old color combination. So we probably have to establish some rules about, well, that color is close enough to the other color combination, but it's a little bit complicated because color space is not equivalent, the categorical boundaries in color space. So, but we should try to take a look at something like that. Are people aware of suppression, and how explicit is it? I actually had a student, Owen Adams, who did some work, and one of his papers won best article of the year in AP&P. They're just generally about like how aware are people of capture when it occurs. And he would have people do these types of tasks where we would rig the task to lead to capture, look for a salient thing and try to ignore another salient thing. And then we'd have participants occasionally on like 10% of trials, they'd give an introspective report about whether or not they were distracted. And this is not what they were instructed with. This is what happened in the middle of the experiment, but they were continuously reminded of, did you shift your attention to the salient thing? We asked them. And we just were curious, are people aware of when they do it? And if we look at search-only trials, we can see that we get a big singleton presence cost. What's really interesting, if we look at their introspective report trials and we compute RTs, you can see that they're on trials where they report no capture, they're actually a lot faster than on trials where they report capture. This could be due to a lot of things. It's consistent with the idea that they have some awareness of capture when it occurs, but it's not fully indicative because they could also just be picking up on their speed of responding or other things. So we ran a second study using eye movements, and we asked them to report whether or not they thought that they were captured in a given trial. And you can see they have some awareness of whether it occurs, in that they're able to pick up when they say they were captured. There is indeed some capture. When they say no capture, there isn't a lot of capture, but they're not perfect. There's also a lot of trials where they're going directly to the target and they're reporting capture. Does that mean that they were covertly captured and we just can't pick up on it with our eye movements? Or there's a lot of sort of ambiguity there. But so this is another one of those, like, maybe they have some level of awareness, but my guess is it's not perfect awareness. Another issue is that in our study, we're asking them continuously to report, so they may start monitoring their performance in a way that's not usual. And we started to see some evidence of that, like they were more prone to capture than they were in typical experiments when we didn't ask about it. I don't think people can, in this task, I don't think people can choose what to suppress. I did run an experiment once where I asked people to select the color they wanted to ignore. So you get to pick it, and then it stayed on the screen for a while. So you had to sit with your choice of like, you're going to suppress the green thing. You chose the green thing to suppress. So this is an example of like, if it's really voluntary, they should know, you should know what you just picked to ignore as a color. And the answer is they get captured by the thing that they just selected to ignore in some of these tasks. So there are certain types of effects that look like that are really cool. There's some negative template stuff out there that's really great. And Nancy Carlisle has written this really cool review paper on it. That's probably not the best explanation of some of these learned suppression effects of salient objects, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Right. We'll find out in the 3.0 version eventually. In the meantime, let's cheer wildly one more time. And